I used to think that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself, my parents would finally see me. That maybe, just maybe, they would look at me the way they looked at Lily, with pride, with warmth, with love. But no matter what I did, no matter how much I achieved, I was always second best. Or maybe I was never in the competition to begin with. I was 5 years old when I first understood that Lily was the favorite. It was her third birthday, a lavish backyard party with pink balloons and a three-tiered cake covered in butterflies. There were gifts stacked so high that they almost reached my shoulders, and every relative, every neighbor, every friend of my parents had come to celebrate her. I remember tugging on my mother's dress, asking if I could have a slice of cake. Not yet, Emma, she said, distracted, fussing over Lily's frilly dress. I waited and waited. By the time I finally got a slice, it was just a leftover piece. Half-eaten, messy, forgotten. That's how it always was. Lily was delicate, Lily was fragile, Lily needed more attention because she was sensitive. It's just how she is, my mother would say whenever I questioned why Lily got the best of everything. A new dress for every occasion, while I wore hand-me-downs. A room filled with toys and dolls, while mine was neatly arranged with books I bought with my own allowance. Grand birthday parties, while mine were quiet dinners with a single candle on a store-bought cake. It's not that we love you any less, Emma, my father once told me when I finally worked up the courage to ask why Lily always got more. It's just that she needs us more. You're strong. You don't need as much help. I was strong, which really meant I was invisible. By the time I was in high school, I had stopped trying to compete for their love and settled for earning my own sense of worth. I poured myself into my studies. I worked hard, harder than anyone. And it paid off. I won academic awards, competed in science fairs, and even got a full-ride scholarship to a top university. My teachers praised me, my classmates envied me. But when I rushed home, excited to share the news, my mother barely lifted her head from her magazine. "That's nice, sweetie," she said, flipping a page. Nice. That was the word she used to shrug off my entire future. Meanwhile, Lily struggled through school. She barely passed her classes, had no real ambition, and spent most of her time jumping from one interest to another without ever sticking to anything. But when she finally graduated high school, without honors, without a scholarship, our parents threw her a massive party. The house was decorated from top to bottom. Music blasted through the speakers, and dozens of guests arrived congratulating her like she had just cured cancer. I stood in the kitchen that night, watching from the shadows, my hands curled into fists. Where was the celebration when I had achieved something? Where was this overwhelming joy when I had worked my ass off for a future I built on my own? That night, I sat alone on the balcony, staring at the stars, realizing the truth. They weren't proud of me. They never had been. Because no matter what I did, it was never about me. I loved the family house. It was more of a mansion than a house, really. It belonged to my grandfather. But he's been leaving it to us since he doesn't want to live in such a large place in his old age. It was the only place that ever truly felt like mine. I had spent my entire childhood in that house, memorizing the creaky spots in the wooden floor, curling up by the fireplace with my books, watching the rain drip down the windows in the winter. When I grew older, I was the one who took care of it. When my parents were too busy to fix the leaking faucet, I did it. When the garden was overgrown, I spent my weekends trimming the hedges. When the house needed repainting, I helped choose the colors. I thought, stupidly, naively, that maybe one day it would be my home. Then one evening, over dinner, I found out the truth. "We've decided to give the house to Lily," my father said casually, scooping another spoonful of mashed potatoes onto his plate. I froze. Lily perked up. "Seriously?" My mother smiled at her. "Of course, sweetheart. You'll need a place now that you're starting your adult life." I set down my fork. My heart was pounding, but my voice came out quiet. "Wait, you're giving Lily the house?" My mother frowned, like she didn't understand why I was asking. "Well, yes, it makes sense, doesn't it?" I swallowed hard. "What about me?" For the first time that night, they actually looked at me, confused, slightly irritated, as if my question was completely unreasonable. "You're independent, Emma," my father said. "You have your own life, your own future. You'll figure things out. But Lily needs a place. She needs stability." It felt like a punch to the gut. I sat there staring at them, realizing just how little I mattered. They hadn't even considered me, hadn't even thought to ask if I wanted the house, hadn't even paused to think about what I might feel. Because to them, I was never a part of their plans. I was just someone who existed in their home, not a daughter, not an equal, just an afterthought. That night, I didn't say anything. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just sat there, letting the weight of it all settle into my bones. And I knew I was done. I had spent my whole life waiting for them to love me the way they loved Lily, waiting for them to see me. But they never would. And now, I wouldn't wait anymore. I should have known my grandfather's passing would come with complications. The man had been the only true source of warmth in my childhood, the only one who had ever seen me. When my parents overlooked me, when Lily basked in all their attention, he was the one who pulled me close, who told me I mattered. And now, he was gone. The funeral was a cold affair, despite the hundreds of mourners who attended. People who barely spoke to him in his final years stood at the podium, delivering empty eulogies about what a great man he had been. My parents accepted condolences with dry eyes, my mother occasionally dabbing at her cheek with a tissue, though I knew there were no real tears behind it. Lily, of course, spent most of the time checking her phone. I stood at the back of the church, clutching the worn-out handkerchief my grandfather had once given me, the one he always carried in his pocket. I had been there in his final years. I had watched him grow weaker, held his hand when he couldn't sleep, listened to the stories of his youth that no one else had patience for. And yet, here I was, pushed aside as my parents and sisters soaked up the attention of being the grieving family. That was what mattered to them, the appearance of loss, not the reality of it. But for me, this wasn't just another transactional moment of social status. This was real grief, and I was the only one who felt it. After the funeral, the family gathered at my grandfather's lawyer's office. The room was stiflingly formal, mahogany furniture polished to perfection, gold plaques gleaming on the bookshelves. Everyone sat in impatient silence, my father tapping his fingers against his knee, my mother clutching Lily's hand, whispering reassurances. They weren't grieving. They were waiting for what was theirs. I already knew what they expected. They assumed the wealth, the businesses, the family estate. It would all go to them, and they would divide it as they saw fit. I wasn't even supposed to be here. I had already been written out of their version of events. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and pulled out a second envelope. That's when everything changed. I have been instructed, the lawyer said, glancing around the room, to read a personal amendment to the will, one that was meant to be revealed only after the standard distribution. My parents straightened, their expressions shifting. My mother forced a tight smile, as if she already knew what was coming. Lily barely looked up from her nails. The lawyer continued, "To Emma." My heart stopped. I could feel my parents staring at me now, my father's face darkening, my mother sitting too still. In my final years, I have come to understand that love is not measured in words, but in actions. And among those I called family, there was only one person who truly showed me love, who sat with me when I was alone, who listened when I had no one else, who gave her time and heart freely. And for that, I leave my home, our home, to Emma. Silence. Complete, utter silence. The weight of his words settled over me, warm and heavy and overwhelming. I felt tears burn behind my eyes, but I blinked them away. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was his final act of love, and I had never needed anything more. The silence was shattered by my mother's sharp intake of breath. "This must be a mistake," she said, voice brittle. The lawyer didn't even flinch. "It isn't. Your father signed and notarized this himself. His wishes are clear. The family home belongs to Emma." My father's fists clenched. That house was meant for Lily. It's always been for her. The lawyer remained calm, but I could see the faint flicker of disgust in his eyes. "Actually," he corrected, "the house was always your father's. He had every right to choose who would inherit it." Lily let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, come on, Emma. What is she even going to do with it?" She turned to me, her voice dripping with mockery. "Sell it? Let it rot?" For the first time, I met her gaze head on. "I don't know," I said, my voice steady, "but I know it's mine." "That did it." My father slammed his hand against the desk. This isn't happening. We'll fight it. We'll take this to court if we have to. You're welcome to, the lawyer said, utterly unimpressed. But I assure you, it's legally airtight. Your father made sure of it. I could see it happening in real time, the realization sinking into them. They had expected everything to go their way. They had planned for it. And now, in one swift moment, it was out of their control. I expected them to turn on me. I expected threats, guilt, pleading, and they didn't disappoint. You know Lily deserves this more than you, my mother said, her tone suddenly soft, almost gentle. She's the one who is always going to stay close to home. She needs it. You don't even belong in that house, Lily added, her voice full of venom. And that was when I realized something. They still didn't see me as a real part of this family. No matter what I did, no matter how much I gave, I was never going to be enough for them. So I made my choice. I straightened in my chair, hands clasped together, my heart beat steady. I don't care what you think I deserve, I said. The words were like steel, cutting through the tension in the room. My grandfather chose me, not you, and I'm not giving up what he left for me. My father's face was red with fury, my mother's expression twisted between shock and betrayal, and Lily looked at me like she didn't recognize me at all. Good, because the Emma they thought they knew, she didn't exist anymore. This was the first time I had ever stood up to them. The first time I had ever seen them truly powerless. And as I walked out of that office, feeling the weight of a life I never thought I could have, I knew one thing for sure. They were about to learn exactly who I was. And this time, I wasn't going to be quiet about it. I had always felt like I didn't belong. Like I was on the outside looking in, watching a family that never really felt like mine. I had spent my whole life rationalizing it, telling myself that maybe I just wasn't the type of daughter they wanted. Maybe if I worked harder, achieved more, proved myself, they'd finally see me. But nothing prepared me for the truth. Because as it turned out, I never really was their daughter. The fight over the house didn't end at the lawyer's office. My parents weren't the kind of people to accept defeat gracefully. No, they came at me with everything they had. At first, it was guilt. Emma, do the right thing, my mother said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, her hands neatly folded. You know Lily needs that house more than you do. Lily needs it? I scoffed, crossing my arms. You mean the way I needed your support growing up? The way I needed a family? Her lips pressed into a thin line. This is different. No, it wasn't. When guilt didn't work, they moved on to manipulation. Think of your future, my father said, trying to sound reasonable. You don't want to waste years in court, do you? I'll take my chances, I replied coolly. And when manipulation failed, they threatened me outright. We'll fight this, my father snapped one night after barging into my room uninvited. You think this is over? It's not. That will should have never been changed, and we'll prove it in court. Go ahead, I said, arms crossed. You'll lose. But something about the way he said it stuck with me. I should have let it go, but curiosity itched at the back of my mind. Why were they so desperate? So I started digging, and that's when I found the first crack in their story. The inconsistencies weren't immediately obvious. But as I started reviewing old documents, old photos, and financial records, things didn't add up. For one, my birth certificate was different from Lily's. It wasn't just the format, it was filed 2 years later than it should have been. And then there were the hospital records. Lily's birth was well documented, but mine was a single-page document signed by my father alone, with no mention of my mother being at the hospital. And then I found it. A hidden envelope buried in my parents' filing cabinet, tucked between tax documents. Inside were legal papers, yellowed with age but clear as day. An adoption agreement. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The words blurred, but I forced myself to read them again. I wasn't their daughter. I was their niece. I sat there for a long time, the documents spread out in front of me, my hands shaking. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their love, their validation, their approval, only to find out I was never really theirs to begin with. I was the child of my father's older brother, a man I had never even known existed. My biological parents had died in a car accident when I was just a baby, and instead of taking me in out of love, my parents had used me. According to the legal papers, my adoption had secured them a financial stake in the family business. That was all I had ever been to them: a pawn, a financial decision, a means to an end. I thought back to every cold dismissal, every moment of being overlooked, every time Lily was showered with affection while I was left with scraps. It all made sense now. They hadn't ignored me because I wasn't good enough. They had ignored me because I wasn't really theirs. I had spent my whole life feeling like I was on the outside of my own family, and I finally understood why. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the documents. At some point, I heard Lily's voice in the hallway, arguing with my mother about something trivial. Their lives hadn't changed. They were still wrapped up in their own world, oblivious to the storm that had just hit me. But as much as it hurt, as much as it shattered the last piece of me that had held onto the hope that I belonged, something else took root: freedom. Because for the first time in my life, I had nothing left to prove. I didn't need to earn their love anymore. I didn't need to fight for a place in a family that had never truly been mine. And most importantly, I didn't owe them anything. Not the house, not my time, not my heart. I had spent my entire life trying to win a game that was rigged from the start. But now, I was done playing. The truth had broken me, but it had also set me free. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't the one who had lost something that day. They were. I always thought revenge was about getting even, about shouting in someone's face, about throwing their words back at them, about making them feel as small and insignificant as they made you feel. But real revenge, the best kind, it's calm, it's quiet, it's letting them dig their own grave and then watching them fall into it. And that's exactly what I did. The moment I found out the truth, that I was never really their daughter, that I'd been nothing more than a legal pawn in their twisted little game, I made a decision. I wasn't keeping the house, not because I didn't love it. I did. The creaky wooden floors, the big bay window in the living room, where I used to curl up with books, the scent of old pine and fresh air. This place had been the only real home I had ever known. But I wasn't going to let them ruin it for me. And I sure as hell wasn't going to let them win. So I called a real estate agent, I signed the paperwork, and I sold it. I didn't tell them. Not until it was too late. The new owners arrived on a crisp Friday morning. A couple in their 40s, polite smiles and eager expressions, stepping out of a sleek black SUV. They held paperwork in their hands, the kind of legal, binding paperwork that left no room for negotiation. My parents were in the kitchen when the knock came. I wasn't there to see it, but I can picture it perfectly. My mother answering the door with her usual graceful politeness, expecting guests, maybe even some kind of business deal. Instead, she found strangers standing on her front porch, holding an eviction notice. "You must be mistaken," she probably said, voice as smooth as silk, as if she could charm her way out of it. But the papers didn't lie. The house, no longer theirs. They had 2 days to leave. I was waiting for their call. I knew it was coming. And sure enough, my phone rang within the hour. I let it go to voicemail. The second call came minutes later. Then the third. By the fifth, I finally picked up. "Emma," my mother's voice was sharp, borderline frantic. "What have you done?" I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window of my new apartment. The view was different. City lights instead of trees, steel buildings instead of quiet streets. But it was mine. "I sold the house," I said coolly, casually, like I was telling her I had just picked up a loaf of bread from the store. "You had no right." "I had every right," I cut her off. "It was mine, remember?" Silence. And then the pleading started. "Emma, listen." My father chimed in, his voice taking on that calm, reasonable tone he always used when he wanted to manipulate me. "Let's not be rash. We can fix this." "There's nothing to fix," I said. "The new owners will be moving in on Monday. You have 2 days to leave." My mother made a choking noise. "Emma, this is our home!" I almost laughed. Our home. The same home they had handed to Lily like a graduation present, like it was never mine to begin with. Now suddenly, it was theirs. "You should start packing," I said simply. And then, for the first time in my life, I hung up on them. The next morning, they showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. When I opened the door, my mother's eyes were red-rimmed, her usual perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled, not in an unkempt way, but in a way that suggested she had been too stressed to care about appearances. My father stood behind her, jaw clenched, the tightness in his posture betraying his barely contained anger. And then there was Lily. She was in full meltdown mode. "You can't do this to us!" she snapped, shoving past my mother and into my apartment like she had every right to be there. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "I already did." Lily's hands curled into fists. "Where are we supposed to go, Emma?" I raised an eyebrow. "Not my problem." My mother let out a shaky breath, stepping forward. "Emma, sweetheart, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." I cut her off. "I understand that you expected me to just give you what was mine. I understand that you thought you could manipulate me, guilt trip me, into handing everything over like I always did." I tilted my head, watching as realization dawned on their faces. "But here's the thing," I continued, voice calm. "I don't owe you anything." My father finally snapped. "You ungrateful little, I laughed. Actually laughed. "Ungrateful?" I repeated, setting my coffee cup down with a soft clink. "That's rich coming from the people who lied to me for my entire life, who used me, who never once made me feel like I was part of this family." Lily crossed her arms, her lip trembling. "So that's it? You're just kicking us out on the street?" "Welcome to the real world, Lily," I said, "where actions have consequences." I watched them leave in defeat, my mother's shoulders slumped, my father's fists clenched, Lily's entire world crumbling. And I felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse. Just peace. Because for the first time, I wasn't playing their game anymore. I had won. And the best part, I didn't even have to fight. I just let them fall exactly the way they deserved. Revenge wasn't about screaming or fighting or making them beg. It was about taking back everything they stole from me and then walking away. And as I shut the door on them for the last time, I realized this was just the beginning. I always thought freedom would feel like a grand moment, like fireworks in the sky or a dramatic scene in a movie where I finally walked away from my past, never looking back. But in reality, freedom was quiet. It was waking up in the morning without a heavy knot in my stomach. It was drinking my coffee without waiting for the next disappointment, the next betrayal, the next rejection. It was sitting in my own space, in my own apartment, and realizing for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely free. And I wasn't going to waste it. I didn't just escape, I thrived. With the money I had from selling the house, I finally did something for myself, something I had always dreamed of, but had never been given the support or encouragement to pursue. I started my own business. Not some corporate, soul-sucking job that my parents would have approved of. No, I built something that was mine, something that made me excited to wake up in the morning. I had always been passionate about design and marketing, and over the years, I had picked up skills here and there. Building websites, branding small businesses, helping people find their voice in a crowded world. So I turned that into a company. At first, it was just me, a laptop, and a rented desk in a tiny co-working space. Then, word spread. Clients started pouring in. People who had been looking for someone to help them build their businesses, their brands. Within a few months, I had too much work to handle alone. So I hired my first employee, then another, then another. Before I knew it, I wasn't just running a business. I was running a successful one that was growing, thriving, and giving people the kind of opportunities I had never been given. And for the first time, I realized something. I had built something for myself, not for my parents, not to prove my worth, not to be good enough for people who would never see me, just for me. I left my hometown behind without hesitation. I packed my things, got in my car, and drove to a new city, one where I wasn't the forgotten daughter, the afterthought, the backup plan. In this place, no one looked at me like I was a shadow standing next to Lily's light. No one dismissed me, ignored me, or expected me to shrink to make room for someone else. Here I was just Emma, and for the first time, that was enough. I made new friends, people who actually cared, who supported me, who cheered me on without hesitation. I found mentors who believed in my potential, people who didn't look at me with doubt, but with admiration. I built a life filled with people who saw me, not as an obligation, not as a tool, but as a person who mattered. And damn, did it feel good? I never realized how much weight I had been carrying until it was gone. For years, I had chased after something that wasn't real: love, validation, family. I had spent so much time trying to earn their approval. Like if I could just be better, do more, achieve something greater, they would finally let me in. But they never would have, because their love was conditional, and I didn't need it. I woke up every morning without dreading the day ahead. I spent my weekends exploring the city, laughing with friends, trying new things, actually living. I decorated my apartment with things I loved, filled my bookshelves with stories I wanted to read, and finally felt like I was creating a life that was mine, not one that was expected of me. And the best part? I didn't miss them. Not my parents, not Lily, not the twisted, suffocating family dynamic I had spent my entire life trapped in. I used to think walking away would be painful, that there would be regret, nostalgia, some part of me that would always long for what I lost. But there wasn't, because I hadn't lost anything. I had escaped, and for the first time, I was truly, completely happy. Starting over was the best thing I ever did. I didn't just leave, I built something better. And every single day, I woke up knowing one thing for certain: I was never going back. I always thought my parents were untouchable. They had built their entire lives on power, control, and appearances, carefully crafting an image of wealth, success, and superiority. They acted like nothing could shake them, like they were above consequences. But the funny thing about people who live for appearances is take away their foundation and the whole damn thing comes crashing down. And I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. The house was everything to them. It wasn't just a place to live, it was their status, their security, their proof to the world that they were better than everyone else. It was where they hosted dinner parties, where they impressed business partners, where my mother could brag to her friends about how perfectly curated their life was. But the moment they lost it, everything started unraveling. They had no real savings. Not because they didn't make enough. No, my father had always been a shrewd businessman, but they had spent years living beyond their means, investing every dime they had into maintaining the illusion of wealth. And their biggest financial cushion had always been the house. They had borrowed against it, used it as leverage for business deals, and assumed that if things ever got tight, they could just sell it for a fortune and start over. Except now, that option was gone. Without the house to bolster their status, people started talking. My father's company had always been built on connections, reputation, and exclusivity. It wasn't enough to be successful. You had to look successful to keep the clients rolling in. But once the rumors spread that he had lost his home, that he was struggling financially, things started to shift. Investors pulled out. Clients backed away. No one wanted to be attached to someone who was losing everything. And the worst part? The business had never really been as strong as my father pretended it was. He had relied on credit, high-risk investments, and handshake deals to keep things running. And the moment people stopped trusting him, the whole thing collapsed. One bad investment turned into two. Two turned into a crisis. And suddenly, the empire he had spent decades building was crumbling beneath him. Lily had never wanted for anything. She had spent her entire life being handed whatever she wanted, never once having to struggle, sacrifice, or work for it. And now, for the first time, there was nothing left to give her. The money was drying up. The family name wasn't opening doors anymore. She tried to live the way she always had, still shopping, still going to expensive brunches, still pretending that everything was fine. But soon, reality hit her. No more designer shopping sprees, no more lavish vacations, no more financial safety net. She tried getting a job, but Lily had never worked a day in her life. She didn't know how to interview, how to answer tough questions, how to prove she was worth hiring. She had spent so long believing she was better than everyone else, and now she was at the bottom, trying to climb a ladder she had never learned to navigate. And she wasn't handling it well. I didn't know how bad things had gotten for them until I got the phone call. My mother's number flashed on my screen one evening, and for a moment, I debated ignoring it like I had every other time she tried to reach me. But something in me was curious, so I picked up. "Emma," she said, her voice soft, hesitant, nothing like the woman I grew up with. "We need to talk." I let out a small laugh, leaning back in my chair. "Do we?" A pause, Then a tired sigh. Things, things haven't been easy. Oh, I know, I said, feigning sympathy. Losing everything must be tough. You don't understand, she snapped, her composure cracking. Your father's business is failing. Lily, her voice broke. We don't know what to do. And there it was. Not an apology, not a confession. Just desperation. You mean, I said slowly, dragging out the words, you don't know how to survive without me? She didn't deny it, because the truth was they had needed me all along. Not as a daughter, not as family, but as a lifeline. I had been the one who had taken care of grandfather. I had been the one who had always worked hard, handled things, been responsible. And when they thought they could discard me, when they thought I was nothing but an inconvenience, they never considered what would happen if I walked away. But now they knew. And they were drowning in the absence of the person they had spent a lifetime pushing away. I could have helped them, I could have saved them, bailed them out, given them another chance, but they had never given me one. So I sat back, let them fall, and watched as the world they built collapsed without me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about it. I hadn't planned on ever going back. For a while, I thought that part of my life was sealed away forever. A closed chapter, a story I no longer needed to tell myself. But after a year of thriving, of building something for myself, of waking up every morning knowing I was free, something inside me whispered that I needed one last thing. Not revenge, not validation. Closure. As I pulled up to the house my parents now rented, the one they had been forced to downsize into after losing everything, I couldn't help but think back to the last time we spoke. The desperation in my mother's voice, the bitterness in Lily's, the quiet anger in my father's. I wondered how much of that had faded, and how much had festered. I knocked. It took a long time before the door creaked open. My mother stood there, and for the first time in my life, she looked small. Not the elegant, well-kept woman I had grown up with. Not the queen of appearances, the woman who could twist any situation into something that suited her narrative. Just small, tired, and worn down. Emma. Her voice was cautious, like she wasn't sure if she should be relieved or terrified that I was standing there. Hey, Mom. She blinked at me, and I could see the thoughts flashing behind her eyes. I was different now. Gone was the quiet, obedient daughter who once longed for scraps of their approval. I stood before her as someone stronger, freer, and completely unshaken by her presence. She swallowed, stepping aside to let me in. The living room was small, cluttered, a little run down. Nothing like the pristine home they once had. My father sat in an armchair, reading a newspaper. He barely looked up when I walked in, his lips pressing into a thin line. And then there was Lily. She was curled up on the couch, staring at her phone. But I could tell by the way her shoulders tensed that she had seen me. Why are you here? She muttered, still not looking up. I had some unfinished business, I said smoothly, settling into the chair across from them. My mother hovered, fidgeting, not sure what to do. My father remained silent, and Lily, well, she still refused to look at me. There was no grand apology, no moment of realization where they suddenly saw the error of their ways. And they were ashamed, sure. I could feel it in the way they avoided my gaze, in the awkward pauses stretching between us. But they were still too proud to fully admit it. That was fine. I hadn't come back to hear an apology that would never come. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope, setting it on the coffee table. My father finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. What is that? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs. Your share of the money from the house sale. Silence. I let them sit in it. My mother's lips parted like she wanted to say something, anything, but for once she seemed at a loss for words. My father's jaw tightened. We don't need your charity. I smiled. Good, because it's not charity. I let my gaze drift between them, calm, unreadable. This isn't about forgiveness, I said, and it's not about settling old debts. It's just what's fair. Lily finally snapped her head up, eyes burning with resentment. You think this makes you better than us? I tilted my head. I don't think it. I know it. Her nostrils flared, her nails digging into the couch. You had everything handed to you. I laughed. Actually laughed. Handed to me? I repeated, amusement flickering in my voice. That's funny, Lily. because I don't remember anyone handing me anything. She scowled, but I could see it now. The exhaustion in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't used to fighting for things. And now that she had to, she was failing miserably. I hadn't come here to gloat. I hadn't come here to watch them squirm or to bask in the downfall they brought on themselves. I came here because I needed them to see. See that I was no longer the girl they could manipulate, no longer the outsider begging to belong. And most importantly, I came here to prove, to myself, to them, to the world, that I was better than them. Because revenge wasn't about making them suffer. Revenge was about choosing to walk away. On my own terms, I stood up, smoothing out my coat. You can take the money or not. It doesn't change anything for me. Lily glared at me. But my parents? They just sat there. For once in their lives, they had nothing to say. And I had everything. As I stepped out of their house for the last time, I took a deep breath. The air was crisp, fresh, full of possibility. For years, I had been weighed down by a past that never really belonged to me. But now I was free. And I didn't need their validation, their approval, or even their regret. Because I had built a life where none of it mattered anymore. And that was the greatest victory of all.